Hello and welcome to Forbidden Talk, a discursive programme tackling controversial social topics in the Middle East. This week we'll be exploring the issue of marital rape. Marital rape occurs when your spouse forces you to have sex or perform sexual acts against your will. Research shows that marital rape can be equally, if not more, emotionally and physically traumatizing than rape by a stranger. Most countries in the West criminalized marital rape from the late 20th century onwards. Yet, even today, many countries in the Middle East do not recognize or punish marital rape or domestic abuse. Today, we'll be asking why are governments in the region failing to acknowledge such gross injustices being carried out against their female citizens? What is the role of a wife, according to Middle Eastern culture? Is it her duty to satisfy her husband sexually? Is it her role to protect the reputation of her husband and family by being silent about the abuse she is suffering? And even if marital rape were to be criminalized, would women in reality speak out? Or is the risk of being ostracized by her community too great? At this point, I'd like to introduce my studio guests. Hilary B. Stauffer, visiting fellow at the Centre for the Study of Human Rights at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and Farouk A. Peru, chairman of the Chronology Institute. Welcome both of you on the programme.
Thank you very much.
But before we move on, let's watch this brief report.
Marital rape in the UK was only criminalised as recently as 1982 in Scotland and 1991 in England. As to the Middle East, legal protection varies between countries, and when it comes to marital rape, and regardless of the laws, many women stay in intimate relationships that are violent or abusive and do not report them. Civil society organisations link this to societal pressure and all the gossip that entails. It could also be linked to avoiding the confusion of their children, the lack of financial independence, and the fear that reporting might lead to further violence. Reasons also include difficulty recognizing or accepting what is happening and even blaming themselves. In 2013, a Moroccan court sentenced a man to 2 years in prison for sexually and physically abusing his wife. In Islam, Prophet Muhammad was quoted saying, "It is a rude manner of a man to proceed to have intercourse with his wife without first playing with her." While Imam al-Ghazali argued, "It is a vice in a man to assault his unprepared wife, seeking to satisfy his own lust and leaving her before she could achieve her own fulfillment." Most of the time, social scientists look at the matter from a subcultural perspective rather than a religious one, linking the act to upbringing and childhood and violence in general. Nevertheless, the Catholic Church in the Middle East imposes compulsory courses for couples before they get married. But biblically speaking, there is no such thing as marital rape. In the scriptures, the only way rape occurs is if a man forces himself on a woman who is not his property, meaning not his wife. The anonymous founder of the Biblical Gender Roles website suggests to avoid pain and damage to a woman, there are ways to make sure she is sufficiently lubricated, even if she is not in the mood for sex. And with the Middle Eastern man's machismo, open calls are directed to wives to entertain more when it comes to sex. But where does one draw the line between a wife compromising to entertain her husband and one that refuses to do so but succumbs to the usually greater physical pressure of the husband?
Farouk, what problems arise when defining marital rape?
Well, I think not only in the context of the Middle East, but universally, the marital space is a hands-off sort of space. So when a couple gets married, it is assumed that their personal space becomes almost untouchable. So when there is this issue, maybe the woman feels that it would be a betrayal of that vow were she to complain. Or the community feels that it would be an undue intrusion on their part if they were to invade that space. But I think a more acute problem in at least Islamic law, which is my expertise, is that there is no acknowledgement of the act itself. So when a woman complains about it, it's not actually in the legal books for anything to be done about it. I think that's the problem.
Right. Hilary, in the report, where does one draw the line between a compromise, giving in to entertain her husband, and actually being forced against her will, succumbing to his brutality, his force? Yeah.
Well, this would be a question of defining rape even outside of marriage. Of course, it's such a touchy legal subject because it is so incredibly subjective as to when women want to engage in sexual intercourse and when they don't, or when they have societal pressures. Sometimes it's peer pressures from their girlfriends or their parents or something. It's not always from their husband or from their religious leaders. It's as much a problem in the Catholic faith as it is in Islam, because in Catholicism, the point of marriage is to procreate. So if the whole point of marriage is to procreate, then you should always be having sex, basically, whether you're enjoying it or not. And so you take the idea of a woman's fulfillment completely out of it. But the spectrum is difficult to tell.
So what you're saying is marriage is actually not between two people. The family is involved, the extended family, the church. Or,
definitely.
you know,
I think society is very involved in marriages. And in the Middle East, which I can't speak to as intimately as perhaps Farouk can, but society, women don't own their bodies. Society owns their bodies. The country owns their bodies. Their family owns their bodies. For so long, you know, they were property. And this is true, obviously, in other faiths and cultures as well. It's just in Islam, it's more true today still. And so if your body is mainly just a bartering chip to get a better marriage or raise your station in society, it's very hard to say you have any autonomy over when to have sex.
But Farouk, you were saying that actually nobody wants to quite touch the marital home.
Well, indeed. I mean, I don't think it's something which people intrude, but as Hilary said, the social element is there by means of moral and social pressure. So let's say if a particularly beautiful woman, she would therefore command a higher, how you say, a better husband, so to speak. In that sense, it has become a tool of social engineering. So when the husband has sort of bought the marriage, he then therefore expects something out of it, and the woman's will is taken out of the equation. So, I mean, it's a very vicious circle, I would think.
Farouk, Ahmad al-Hout in Lebanon, he angered quite a few campaigners last year when he said marital rape doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. He said there's nothing called rape between a husband and a wife. It's forcing someone violently to have intercourse. And what do you say to that?
Well, I say that is that statement was born out of the ignorance of the spirit of the Quran, when the Quran speaks about marital relations to be something which is positive and empowering and comforting. When this person denies the fact that sometimes it is not, what he's doing is he is denying the protection due to the wife in the event of this act.
Would you agree with that, Hilary?
I would agree with it. I think this is when we need laws more than ever, though. I do understand, of course, my own tradition as an American. We have a separation of church and state, and we feel quite strongly about it. But this is where, I mean, only 52 countries in the world have any kind of laws which criminalize marital rape. And in the Middle East, I think it's only Turkey and Israel, and both of those have a lot of problems with implementation. And so if society and if religion and if families cannot define what rape is, perhaps we need the laws to say what rape is, to say this is the minimum standard that we agree to is unacceptable. And then there's always going to be room for interpretation. I mean, there's lots of laws protecting women outside of marriage or criminalizing rape, and it's still only reported 6% of the time. I mean, there's so many pressures on women regardless of whether it happens in marriage or out of marriage.
And Farouk, when girls are growing up, how are they taught about marriage? What are they taught?
I would say outside the official education, there is always the notion that marriage is a means of social mobility. And you know, when this is the case, you know, the sexual element becomes the hidden element of that social mobility. I mean, certainly when a husband marries a wife who he feels is of a particular standard of beauty or station, he then feels as if he owns her. So this mentality is perpetuated, if you like, through various stages of social processes.
Hilary, this mentality, is it cultural or religious?
I think it's both. I mean, in the Middle East, certainly culture and religion are very intertwined, and I don't know when you can pull one away from the other. It is absolutely certain that culture and religion are an umbrella which overarch everything. Every discussion has to be within the frame of Islam, or in Israel within the frame of Judaism, or within Iran, other, you know, if they have other beliefs, and within Italy, within the Catholic Church. So when culture and religion are so strongly intertwined, except for in those countries where it is such a secular society, and it's hard to say in the Middle East. I mean, certainly women are still very much expected expected to stay in the background, I think.
And what are the expectations of a good wife?
They are generally to serve and submit, and certainly there are examples of very strong women in the Middle East. We all know them. We can pick some out. We could say them right now. But it is to serve and submit and be a good wife. But who decides what a good wife is? Being a good wife means something very different in Palestine than it does in California. And in the States, you're supposed to be perhaps an equal. You're supposed to both bring equality to the marriage, and that's just not the same culture that we have in the Middle East. And it's important to realize that.
Okay, we'll hold that thought. Now I'd like to welcome over Skype Ghida Anani, founder and director of Abad, Center for Gender Equality based in Beirut. Ghida.
Hi, Afri.
Hi there. What are the latest marital rape figures in Lebanon?
Well, I'm afraid to say that it's almost now, we're facing like 75–80%, where we have one aspect or another of forced sexual behavior within marriage that is being so much associated with gender-based violence and domestic violence that the women are facing. Now with the issue also of refugees and displacement, it's being more and more something that we're witnessing being reported over listening and counseling sessions with women survivors of violence.
Ghida, can you give me an example of a refugee situation? What stories are you hearing?
Yeah, to be honest, like as you all might be aware, here the situation in Lebanon is that we don't have refugee camps as per se. They're being accommodated either in with host communities. That's why like everything related to family relationship is being quite challenging, especially the spousal relationship. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Yeah. So that's why we, with the crowdiness at home, all the stressful factors, usually the woman is being not only, of course, vulnerable to physical violence as a way to cope with the situation, but also everything pertaining to spousal relationship is almost happening either by force or in challenging situations because of lack of spaces. So if they have a moment, this is where even sometimes the husband, it's the way to cope to the new gender role. It's being forced on men, Syrian men, being unable to be the bringing the money to the family or decision making. So with all the shifting of gender role.
Okay, so he's very much in control. But who can a woman even go to report marital rape in Lebanon?
Well, I've been listening to the colleagues talking about the cultural context. I have to say there is, even in Lebanon and in the Middle East, but specifically in Lebanon also, this is something very culturally being rejected and opposed. Even to call it a marital rape or to go and report only and solely because of living sexual violence within the spousal relationship. It's not acknowledged as being a form of gender-based violence. Usually with these concepts of obedience and ownership and property that is brought by the religion and the culture, talking about marital rape is not really an option, even not an option to introduce within awareness raising efforts that we're doing in communities. For instance, we had, as Abad, dialogue sessions with religious institutions representatives to talk specifically about this concept, and there's a huge gap between the understanding of marital rape by the civil society institutions and those by the religious institutions that consider the core, the essence of the concept of rape is when you take something by force that it's not belonging to you. This has been the explanation of the Mufti here in Lebanon. So when we explained okay, it's taking by force something, or as you say, sometimes raping a land or raping a property, for the religious institution in marriage, one is becoming belonging to the other, so hence you cannot talking about it's not your property.
Ghida, I'm going to bring in some of my studio guests here. Hilary, marital rape not even acknowledged in the Middle East. Does this surprise you?
It doesn't, because it is something, I mean, picking up on what Ghida said, it is, if women are considered property, then it's difficult to conceptualize violating property in a sexual way, and so the debate doesn't even reach that. But I just wanted to pick up on something she said about the refugees. This is a major problem, because especially young girls are getting married off, I mean, whatever term you want to use, to much, much older men. And their parents have the best of intentions. Their parents are concerned that their 12 and 14 and 15-year-old daughters will be raped or sexually abused in the refugee camps. So they think, oh, I'm saving my daughter by giving her to this much older man. But this is a violation of human rights on several levels, mainly at the age of consent. The idea of consent doesn't even come into it. But then, you know, there's questions of, are they even old enough to, can they object? I mean, do they have enough agency to even say, this isn't what I want, or I'm 13 years old and I'm not mentally prepared to have sex with you? And then can we even call it rape, or is it child abuse? I don't know, but the refugee camps are a major problem.
So Farouk, is rape, it could be defined as saving, in a way, saving someone from their terrible situation, being in a refugee camp.
You know, I do feel that if these men were really trying to save these girls, they don't need to marry them. Why not just give them economic opportunities to migrate and resettle wherever it is they need to be?
Ghida, are some women even aware that marital rape is not normal?
Of course, from the experiences of our listening and counseling centers, the women, they acknowledge that there is something wrong, or there's something they're not. I don't feel like comfortable or satisfied, or I feel there is something wrong in the communication with the husband. But this is only, if you want, brought to the forefront in the reporting when it's associated with other forms of violence. So they don't go to talk only about this. They might go to talk when it reached the point violence is also physical, or extremely economic, or sometimes related to inheritance, which is also a concept related to the confessional system here in Lebanon and in the Middle East. So they will acknowledge it as one form of violence, but when it's associated with others. And there's something that I really wanted to join my colleague in talking, when we're talking also about the child marriage, if you may allow. It's here, it's not only happening as a kind of saving or doing a favor to the children. Unfortunately, here it's more about being now called protection marriage, by not fearing from the economic opportunities, but as a mean for families to protect their girls from sexual harassment in the refugee and displacement setup. So they tell you, and they will report that, okay, yeah, we're pushing our girls into forced marriages, but it's the best for them to be protected from the sexual harassment and sexual violence, and eventually protecting the honor of the family. So it's better if she's married rather than being a girl that might be vulnerable to other, especially the sexual violence, which is very taboo in this side of the world.
Yes, yes. And activists say Lebanon's first law criminalizing domestic violence doesn't go far enough. Do you agree with this?
Yes, of course, because it's when you do legal reform without a comprehensive policy reform and structural reform, and the government is not assuming its responsibilities in setting up the reporting mechanism and the protection application, it's definitely not going anywhere forward. And contrary, it's in some situations is also an additional risk on the lives of the women.
And Ghida, Lebanon seems to give the impression that it's one of the more liberal countries in the Middle East. Is this the reality?
Yeah, I would have to say culturally and social norms, women, we can say definitely they're fulfilling much rights and they're more active in the public spaces. And you have this kind of schizophrenia in the society where you have families and groups and areas where the women are very much educated and advanced and they actively participate in societies. But nevertheless, there are still some areas in the suburbs where women are still being oppressed and they're not participating and they are facing many forms of discrimination. And this is only because of the mentioned personal status code, being a society with this kind of contradicting system. You have civil practices, but also you have still the confessions and the religion not only governing the culture, but also the legislations that regulate your daily life relationship with the system and in the family. So this is where I think we're in a transition currently between like set culture and traditions into like a new wave of taking the country into more and more a civil structures and civil legislations.
Ghida, that's wonderful. Thank you for participating on the program today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And honor to meet your colleagues as well.
Thank you.
Hilary,
I think the last point that Ghida made, the culture and religion sort of fusing together and hopefully becoming a bit more separated in Lebanon.
I think Lebanon's a very good example. I mean, certainly some of the, let's say, more liberal societies in the Middle East, perhaps Lebanon, Jordan, Morocco to some extent, although Morocco just changed their laws about marital rape last year, do have some promising developments. But a lot of the things that Ghida mentioned, and I think she's very correct about them, very much take place perhaps in the cities. What do we do about rural women? What do we do about those who are uneducated or live far away from Beirut or from Amman and don't have any access to knowing that these laws even exist, much less how to implement them? And that's going to be a bigger question, as it is in all countries, of course, but especially in the Middle East. Some of the more rural areas are very, very cut off from any modernization that is happening.
Yeah. And Farouk, with reference to the Quran, does it specifically mention that a woman belongs to a man?
Absolutely not, no. As I mentioned in the verse before, it is a case of mutual companionship, and there is an environment of tranquility and mercy and compassion within this relationship. That being the case of legally belonging doesn't arise.
And communication? Because Ghida said that there is a lack of communication between the man and the woman.
Indeed, I mean, in a patriarchal society, I would think that this doesn't exist because a woman is not allowed to voice her discontent. You know, discontent is seen as rebellion. And, you know, suddenly the man is seen to be the owner of the marriage and the woman herself. And he just has to give the word and she has to do his bidding.
And how about having his sexual needs fulfilled in either the Quran or the Hadiths?
Well, in the Quran, as I said before, it is an environment of compassion. That's what it instructs, and therefore we cannot have any kind of compulsion in sexual acts. However, in the Hadith, there are elements which show a great deal of liberalism, showing a great deal of care for the needs of the woman. However, there are also Hadith which gives a kind of a moral blackmail upon the woman if she does not submit. And this being the case, the woman feels compelled and she thinks, oh, it is actually God who is telling me I need to do this, even though I may not like it.
Hilary, how do female sexuality and male sexuality differ in the Middle East?
I think that there is, I mean, I think they're both very suppressed, to be frank. We don't talk a lot about male sexuality. We talk about male machismo. We talk about the culture of males being the head of patriarchy, perhaps as Farouk said. But, and there's something, male sexuality is not, I mean, certainly, obviously, homosexuality is not discussed at all, but male sexuality, other than, the way that shows up in pop culture as being able to attract the most beautiful woman. But do Middle Eastern men talk about what their sexual needs any more than Middle Eastern women talk about what their sexual needs are? I think this is something that is very much the the Provence of the West right now is speaking so freely about what we expect out of our sexual relationships.
But do men talk about the prize?
The prize being?
The woman.
The women, oh, well, certainly, yes. I mean, women are not, even in the West, but certainly in the Middle East, women are not necessarily expected to, they don't get to choose their spouse a lot of the time, do they? Hopefully they do. And in some of the more developed countries, maybe they do. In some of the more elite parts of society, they would. It's more equal. But in most places, the woman is told who she will be marrying. So the man gets to choose who he thinks is the prettiest, but that doesn't necessarily mean they will be a good match sexually.
Okay, well, on to our next Skype guest, Paola Salwan Deher in Geneva, Global Advocacy Advisor at the Center for Reproductive Rights and a passionate campaigner for women's rights. Paola, it is said that spousal rape is more psychologically damaging than rape by a stranger. What are the consequences?
Well, first of all, I think it's very dangerous to make a difference between rape by a stranger and rape by a husband. It's a distinction that is applied by many legal frameworks throughout the region, and that usually criminalizes rape by a stranger and doesn't criminalize rape, marital rape. So I think first off, we should avoid at all costs to make that difference. A rape is a rape, and there are no hierarchy to be made between who is the perpetrator and on the basis of who is the perpetrator. That being said, if you want to talk about consequences, a woman survivor of marital rape is facing increased risks of unwanted and unintended pregnancies, a lack of access to reproductive health services, a lack of access to modern contraception, of course, because of the situation of increased violence she finds herself in. And she also, of course, finds herself at an increased risk of contracting STIs, including HIV/AIDS. The other consequences that also stem from that type of violence is increased vulnerability to economic and domestic violence in general.
And Paola, does one's socio-economic background affect the likelihood of her being raped?
Well, I think violence against women in general and marital rape in particular does not discriminate based on your socioeconomic background. So I don't think that one could say that there's a difference. However, I think there's a case to be made with regards to intersectionality of different oppressions. For example, refugee population and migrant worker population in the Middle East and North African region are, of course, more at risk of rape and violence in general because they face institutionalized oppressions that specifically target them. So they're more at risk to face rape, especially by people in position of power. But in terms of marital rape, there are no differences between socioeconomic strata.
But perhaps a woman who's been better educated has access to more awareness about the fact that marital rape is wrong.
I think that a woman, regardless of her level of education, knows perfectly what consent is. And I think that they can tell whenever they want to have sex or not, to be very blunt. So I don't think that has anything to do with the level of education. Besides, the level of taboo with regards to this specific issue and the legal frameworks apply to all women. So whether a woman is educated or not has really no impact. Maybe she will know that it's wrong. Of course, she will know that it's wrong, but the law applies to her the same way it applies to someone who's more disenfranchised. So there will be virtually no protection. If you take the example of Lebanon, for example, there is no criminalization of marital rape. So there's no difference really.
And Paola, how easy is it to get access to women who are being sexually abused at home?
Well, I would say it's extremely difficult for various reasons. The first reason, of course, is that there's the sanctity of the house. The private sphere is seen as something that really is not political. It does not regard the state. So people tend to keep these issues for themselves or within very closed groups among their friends or family. So it's very difficult to even get women to talk about what they're facing. And there's a whole other level of taboo that comes into with regards to sexuality, especially sexuality with one's husband. It's not something that is very
Even when violence is concerned?
Especially when violence is concerned. It's very difficult to have history of abuse, a woman will not share easily if she's being abused or not. And people will not encourage her. And not only the level of taboo is very high, but I think that the lack of access to justice and legal remedies tend to discourage a woman to talk about these issues.
So supposing a woman wants to leave her home, where can she go?
I think it would really depend on where you are, which country you are. There are risks. There are risks that she might face to lose the custody of her children. So that might be very difficult for her to want to leave the house. The problem is there are many programs throughout the region that aim at creating, for example, safe shelters for women who have been abused. But these shelters really tend not to work because women in the Middle East, they would not go and seek shelter, because some of them do not have the financial capacity to live without the financial support of their husbands. And also because it's not really something that is done simply. I think it has a lot to do with cultural norms. And so leaving an abusive relationship, especially if one does not have family support or does not have enough socioeconomic independence, proves to be very difficult for abused women.
And Paola, the argument is that the family and home are sacred and must be protected, and a woman speaking up is in effect ruining the harmony. But actually, in reality, if children are witnessing their mother being abused and raped, surely the consequences are great there. Do we know how children are affected?
There are studies about how children are affected, and I can give you an example, a horrible example that happened in Lebanon. Just a couple of weeks ago, a woman called Sarah Amin was shot 17 times by her husband in front of her children because she was threatening to leave him, and she was threatening to sue him under the new law to protect all members of women and all members of family. And so she was, because of that threat, he kind of lured her back into the home only to kill her in front of their children. So I think that's a very stark example of how violence against women can really have a devastating impact on children, because of course there are psychological trauma that they will have to live with for the rest of their life. On top of that, there will be virtually, this is a very public case, so there might be no impunity on this case, but so many cases happen where the perpetrator really gets let off very easily. So there are also no compensation for the victims and for their families, including their children.
What do you think is the most effective way to reach out to women in order to mobilize them so they could increase their rights?
I think that all mechanisms should be used. I think local civil society organizations have a big role to play in terms of really publicizing the cases, the stark cases of violence against women, like Sarah Amin, but also in terms of mobilizing the primarily concerned population. So that goes with, for example, using all kinds of media, including social media, but not limited to social media. Newspapers have to be used, TV, radios. There's an organization, for example, if I take the example of Lebanon again, it's called CAFA, and they've used billboards, they've used TV spots, they've used newspapers, Facebook, Twitter, etc., just to get people talking about the issue. And then you start and gather interest on, what are the means at your disposal to try and challenge stereotypes and challenge legal frameworks, laws, practices, policies that are really oppressing to women. And then you can start building a movement. So I think there's a lot that can happen locally, but there's also a lot that can happen at the regional and international level. Now, at the international level, it really is a partnership between different civil society organizations that can really support one another. An organization like mine, for example, can support local actors in accessing the international human rights mechanisms, to compile submissions to treaty monitoring bodies, and attend the Human Rights Council, and really try and get to these global actors that can influence global policies.
Paola, thank you so much for joining us today and for your contribution.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hilary, you were nodding there quite a lot. I think you wanted to
I
add.
did. Well, I wanted to add, I agreed with so much of what Paola was saying. She was highlighting so many key issues. I would push back on a couple of things, though. I agreed with her that, of course, any woman knows when she's having sex against her will. You know when, if this is something you wanted to do or not. But I think then we have to talk about the larger problem of early marriages in the Middle East, which I mentioned briefly before. But when whether it's in a refugee camp or not, there's, in a lot of places the age of consent is 18 or 16, but if you go to a local judge, they will give their consent for the girl to be married younger. Does she know whether or not she wants to have sex? Maybe she doesn't even know what's happening to her, so can she consent if she's that young? And that's a larger question of culture again. And I think there's also questions of just the conservatism in society overall and issues about, she's saying that there's all these international mechanisms they can access if they get enough help. And I think that's true probably in big cities. Again, I worry about these women who don't have access to, yes, mainly, that's my concern there.
Yeah. Farouk, of course there's the argument, if a wife doesn't give her body, he's going to find it elsewhere. How would you respond to that?
Well, I think that's more of a business transaction than a marriage, I would think. I mean, a husband who does not give the kind of understanding a wife deserves, then really the marriage was all about his sexual needs rather than starting a family or being a productive part of society. It's more about the lower goals than the higher goals, so to speak.
Hilary, why is the woman so often blamed for the collapse of the family if she speaks up?
Well, because the laws are very much stacked against her, to be honest. In much of the Middle East, the laws say that if the woman leaves, she doesn't get to take her children with her. And there's the other question of honor and the question of shame, of course, also. And so the woman through her Jezebel acts can bring shame on the family, whether it's taking the children from the man who is the patriarch or whether it is letting everybody know her dirty laundry. And I mean, honor killings are terrifying to behold. They happen more often in South Asia, perhaps, than they do in the Middle East these days. But it's terrifying. But it's also just cultural. Women have been, perhaps since the time of Adam and Eve, it has been the woman's fault when something goes wrong. And I don't know how to solve that.
But do you think that people are afraid to talk about marital rape because it might give ammunition to the more conservative among the society? So in a way, their whip will be tightened if they even talk about it.
Well, I think they're afraid to talk about marital rape because we don't have widespread freedom of expression within the Middle East to talk about much of anything. These subjects are taboo, and if people, the longer they're taboo, the more that people are told, you can never speak of this, you can never speak of this, it'll never come to light. If we just talked about it more often, it would stop being so uncomfortable all the time. I actually think it would give the liberals, the progressives, the impetus then if we talked about it more, because then everyone could say this is a problem and we acknowledge it.
Would you agree there, Farouk?
I would like to add by saying that marital rape is a symptom of the deeper systemic misogyny of that society.
Well, I was just about to say, how much is a man's word believed over a woman's in the Middle East generally?
Well, under Islamic law, it shouldn't be the case, but certainly there are kind of social misogynies which do make it to be the case, as Hilary would say, being the Jezebel, so to speak. A woman's desire is seen to be something which should be held back. But
on the desire note, the Quran says that sex in marriage is something to be enjoyed by both sexes.
Indeed.
And the Bible stipulates that just as a woman's body belongs to her husband, a man's body belongs to his wife. So what's being lost here?
Well, I think there is a great gulf between scripture and culture. Perhaps, if you take a secular perspective, you can say a scripture is a book which someone brought to a society. Now, that society is not in an ideological vacuum. It has a certain resistance to that. So what it does is it fabricates information to somehow bring a balance to the reforms that scripture seeks. Now, in the case of Islam, there is the hadith. So the hadith gives a kind of a moral blackmail to the woman. Either you serve or God will bring his wrath upon you. When you say stuff like that, and the woman thinks, okay, well, really my role is to serve, and therefore I don't really have a choice in the matter.
Can I pick up on something Farouk just said, which is about who the Bible and the Quran and perhaps the Torah all say amazing things about marriage and what a partnership it is. For 2,000, 5,000, 700 years, whatever it's been, it has been men interpreting the Torah and the Quran and the Bible.
Absolutely.
And so perhaps this is why no one is actually, everyone interprets things to the best of their ability and no one is actually reading exactly what the words say. The power structures are all men in these three major religions and in countries around the world, of course. And women at best make up 20% of decision makers in governments across the world, including Western governments. So it's not surprising that over thousands of years of practice, whether through the Hadith or anything else, the men have interpreted it in a way that best suits their needs, because that's just human nature.
Okay, well, we have to move on now, but on to the next section, where we shall be exploring how the stigma of marital rape in the Middle East can be challenged and overcome. Hilary, why is the concept of shame not quite the same for men?
I think it goes back to perhaps what we were talking about earlier, in that men are in power, so they don't have anything to be ashamed of, or they have more support from society. It's easy to say when you're the person in power to say, it's not my fault, or that person made you do it.
So raping a woman is not going to cause shame?
Well, there's no consequences, though, is there? There's no consequences for the man, generally. I mean,
morally?
But morally fine. Morally fine, you can, but that's between you and your God, perhaps. And that's considered very private, where for the woman, the consequences of her shame can be quite public. If she speaks out, she brings dishonor on her family, she may lose her children, and, you know, be cast out from society. It is, so a man can say, I felt awfully bad about that, or maybe he can say, but my wife wasn't giving me what I wanted anyway, so I had to go get it somewhere else. It was her duty to submit, and she didn't. So again, it's her fault.
It's probably a universal excuse rather than a Middle Eastern. Farouk, are there any male campaigners out there speaking up about domestic violence and marital rape?
Absolutely. I mean, where I come from, Malaysia, the men are equally aghast about this phenomenon, and we are equally against the patriarchal clergy, which simply denies its existence. And, you know, I do feel that there will be a change in time to come.
And Hilary, how important is it that men speak out?
They have to speak out. They have to be, it has to be 50-50 or 100-100. It has to be a dual thing, because otherwise the women don't even have the capacity to speak up on their own behalf. So at this point, we still need men to draw attention to the problem and say, I'm brave enough to stand with you.
Well, now welcoming Lina Khalife from Jordan, founder of She Fighter, the first self-defense studio for women in Jordan, designed to empower women both physically and psychologically through self-defense training. Lina, do victims of marital rape come to see you?
Actually, no, they don't come to see me. It's a very sensitive and new topic that we actually didn't start talking about it yet in public. In the Middle East, it's actually new, and the laws doesn't actually support women who face rape during marriage. And we are fighting against more as domestic violence and sexual harassment. And usually what we actually focus on is more public awareness, because if you actually change the law, women will not report to the police. So what we need to do is create more public awareness between women and men in the society, so we can actually touch that topic, marital rape, and talk about it. Especially that culture and religion doesn't actually support marital rape. They say it's more, it is actually for women, has to satisfy men during marriage. So even if they're forced to do it. So
how are you raising awareness then? By what means?
Yeah, but what we do is more like we speak at universities to students, to at schools as well. We speak to more the rural areas. We do some awareness seminars for women. Other than self-defense as well.
Okay, so you go to the rural areas and those who are less well off or who don't have access to education or universities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they do actually have we do have access to universities, and also the girls and women, they actually have access to universities and education, but it's still culture that shows them that they can't actually report to the police. And also the law of Jordan, I want to read one of the laws. It's in eight Arab countries, and it doesn't support marital rape at all. It says, whoever has sexual intercourse with a woman other than his wife without her consent, whether through threat, deception, or fraud, is punished with hard labor for no less than 15 years. So they say other than his wife. So even if he actually forced his wife to do sex or have an intercourse, it means it's totally his right to do it, because they're now husband and wife. And if they actually have a problem inside the family, they usually sort it out outside the court because they want to keep the family safe.
Right, and do you see change happening in Jordan? That's pretty tough, what you just read, but are times changing?
It is actually. We're more now aware about sexual harassment, for example, domestic violence. But every time I speak to public, I get many, people attacking me back, telling me that what you are doing is not right and it's against religion and culture.
You say people. What sort of people? Men?
Usually men.
Do you get abuse from women as well?
Yeah, but women, they actually think about it. Like when we have a group discussion and some women, they don't agree with what I'm saying, they usually ask themselves questions, want to talk more about it, but they're more open about talking about the issue. But they are afraid of men. That's why some of them, they don't want to, be open to, for example, marital rape or domestic violence. They want to keep what they are, living on, so they don't actually hurt their families.
I'm just going to bring in Hilary there. Afraid of men. Women are afraid of men.
Oh, well, I think women certainly are afraid of men, but I think they're more afraid of disappointing the culture and society that they live in. Certainly they're afraid of physical violence, whether sexual or domestic or other kinds, but they're more afraid of disappointing the support structures they have around them, because it's what one of our earlier speakers said: what happens if you leave your husband? Where do you go? Where you don't have the money, you don't have the education, perhaps in some situations, or you don't have any way to get a job, so you have to stay in an abusive situation because it just makes the most sense.
Lina, how do you help women on an emotional or psychological level? How do you help them overcome this taboo?
Well, some of them, they come talk to me about it, and they're afraid to report to the police about their violence at home. But what I do is I recommend them to report as soon as possible, because they don't want to hurt themselves more and more. And most of them, they're not aware that some laws actually are with women. So if they report, they actually can defend themselves and their families from getting hurt in the future.
What laws are with the women? Is there a particular one that comes to mind?
Well, if you actually go to the police and report about a threat or an assault, they usually bring, let's say your husband is attacking you or your father, they call him, they get him to the police station, and they let him sign an agreement that he will never do it again, or he will be in jail. So at least he can actually, sign, and he knows that he will be he will be in jail if she reported again. But most of them are afraid of getting back home after reporting to the police, because the husband or the father might actually kill his daughter or his wife or attack her back, and she will never be able to actually reach to the police. So, but reporting to the police can be a good thing to put that or the attacker in jail. It depends whoever it is.
And Lina, you were highlighted recently by President Obama during his speech about emerging young entrepreneurs globally. Congratulations for that. But do you have any plans to open up she fighters in the Middle East anymore? Or is that even allowed?
Yeah, I'm actually thinking to expand She Fighter all over, not just the Middle East, but there is like high rate of crimes and domestic violence and crimes in Latin America as well, Europe and Africa. So it's not just the Middle East. What I'm actually facing, the hard thing is more legal things. So if I want to open up in Saudi Arabia, it's going to be really hard to register my business as Women Empowerment Studio. I have to. It's going to be like crazy, you know, like fight there in Saudi Arabia.
Lina, they're laughing in the studio here.
Yeah.
Crazy idea.
Yeah, I've been, you know, asking about more legal things on how for women to actually franchise or open or partner with other women in different areas in the Middle East. It's actually really, really hard, and it's really complicated, and it takes too much time and too much money as well.
Of course. Well, so, thanks so much, Lina, for being with us today. You're an inspiration for us all.
Thank you, Anna.
Okay. Hilary, do you think part of a woman's fear is actually going to the authorities and being laughed at?
Certainly. I think that they're afraid that they will be laughed at. I think they're more afraid that they'll be arrested for doing something wrong, though. Part of that is just ignorance, but part of it is that there are terrible laws that still exist. And the law that Lina read, there's a second clause to that one that basically says, but he won't be punished as long as he marries the person that he raped. So if the constitutive act of your marriage is a rape, then anything that comes after that probably will be against your will as well. So the laws, even if they're not enforced that much, those are the ones that everybody hears about, and it's just a culture of fear, telling women not to report.
Well, I wanted to raise the example of in Saudi Arabia. There was a case in 2006. The woman was sentenced to 90 lashes for being raped because she wasn't accompanied by a male. So in that case, they gave her 90 lashes. But when her lawyer appealed to the Saudi General Court, they said, well, no, we're going to double your sentence, and gave her more lashes. So, Farouk, how can the authorities turn round investigations of crimes against women into sort of the moral judgment call?
Well, we have to understand the kind of Islamic law which is being practiced in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia practices an ultra-literalist interpretation of Islamic law. And for them, when a woman participates inadvertently, forcibly in the rape act, she thus becomes an adulteress, and therefore she is punished by that law. So it's ridiculous. Unfortunately, this is where literalism fails.
Hilary, activist and journalist Mona Eltahawy has said that the most subversive thing a woman can do is talk about her life as if it matters.
I think that's true, and I mean, it was good of Farouk to bring up, you know, and the very extreme example of Islam in Saudi Arabia, of course, and this is the problem with extreme interpretations of every religion. They certainly bring out the worst in people, where religion should be, you know, a unifying force for good and humanity. When we take it to the extremes, it brings out the worst. And, you know, the questions of in Saudi or other places too is where is the accountability? Yes, if a woman gets raped through no fault of her own, but is then lashed in public for being an adulteress. How could she possibly empower herself? Except perhaps social media is the answer. I was grateful to our guests for bringing that up earlier because, I mean, Saudi Arabia is very connected to Facebook and Twitter. They're quite active, and because they don't have a lot of other outlets for interaction. And so that's a way to say, if you were brave enough to say, this happened to me and it was awful, the magic of social media is that it can then become hashtag activism around the world.
But why doesn't Saudi suppress that?
That's a very good question. Perhaps they want something of a pressure valve for their society. There's so many, it's such a conservative society that they think at least giving them some freedom of expression is helpful. But there is, I mean, certainly the blasphemy laws are quite strong. So when people then say something on social media, people do get arrested for saying it then.
Well, now I'd like to welcome Fatima Siddiqui over Skype from Morocco, Senior Professor of Linguistics and Gender Studies at the University of Fez, author and founding director of the ISIS Center for Women and Development. Fatima, is violence against women increasing or decreasing in the Middle East? Or is it a case that women are just talking about it more openly?
I think that given the conclusions of the the international conference we have just finished organizing yesterday is that there is an increase in violence against women. And marriage rape is on the increase. In spite of the fact that in a country like ours, for example, there was a big scandal in 2012 when a young woman, 16-year-old, was obliged to marry her rapist, and civil society rose as one person in spite of an Islamist government and managed to force a change in the law. I heard that social media is important, yes, but I also believe that activism is still very important because it can lead to change.
And with regards to women wanting to break free from domestic abuse situations, how can the lack of social institutional support for girls and women in the Middle East be overcome?
Yes, well, we should first understand why. Because we live in a space-based patriarchy where women's bodies, women's voice, women's actions do not have authority, and they may have power but not authority. And I usually explain authority as power not sanctioned by society. So yeah, I mean, it's women are weak in the public sphere. And this explains the increase in violence, in sexual harassment, in the taboo that all these things, I mean, carry. But I don't think that, I mean, nothing stagnates. I believe that women and men and youth will end by finding a solution to this, because we are not regressing, although, I mean, with the increase in religious extremism, I admit that it's very difficult, but sure, I mean, we should keep up hope.
And you mentioned earlier the conference on the escalation of women in the MENA region, which you organized. I'm sure various issues were raised, but what were some hopeful conclusions brought?
I think there are several aspects of hope. The first one is networking. I mean, it depends on your position, whether you are an activist or a victim or whatever. But anyway, this is a conference. This in itself, it's the nature of the event dictated the necessity to network, because violence is transnational and transnational in the region, and it also goes beyond the region itself. So this means that we need a transnational networking in the face of such violence. And also, well, a lot of people insisted on education, education, education. I heard this many times, that educating people, educating the man, educating the family, because these things are not, I mean, these things grow inside a specific context, which is the family. The problem with the type of violence that we are discussing today is that we are in the family, and the family is considered like a close space, honor and all that. But believe me, I mean, in Morocco, we are dealing with these domestic types, with these types of domestic violence.
Fatima, thank you so much for your expertise and being with us today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Farouk, do you think marital rape should be penalized the same way as stranger rape?
If not the same way, I think it should be penalized more, because there is an element of trust involved here. The investment of one's emotion into that relationship, and when that is betrayed, it will have consequences just as bad or even worse than stranger rape, so to speak.
And Hilary, I mean, Fatima seems to think so, but is the Middle East ready for women to have more just rights in general?
I think so. I was quite heartened by her statement, and I wrote it down and I underlined it, because I do think it's true that we're not regressing. Evidence to the contrary, you can pick out these terrible examples but of these things that happen in Morocco and elsewhere. But yes, first of all, women are becoming more educated every day. The university graduates are coming out from all countries in the Middle East, and they are entering government, and they are traveling more, and they are getting ideas from elsewhere to coming home and saying, I think this isn't quite good enough anymore. And the authority structures, the power structures will resist it, but it's 2015, it's the 21st century. At some point, this will just seem so old-fashioned.
And Farouk, in terms of the Middle East, in terms of women's rights, is there a leading country out there that's setting the example, or a leading individual that you can think of?
I like Mona Al-Tahtawi very much. I mean, I think her book on, I think it was female sexuality, I think that was groundbreaking.
And her Headscarves and Hymens is very good
indeed,
as well.
and she spoke about something which essentially people go red when asked about, you see. So I think if the Middle East is not ready, it should be made ready, because the kind of damage this incurs is just too much. It's too high a price.
Henry, what would you like to be seeing done, first of all?
I would like to see women access their rights more. I would like to see them talk about the problem of marital rape, and if they can't do it right within their family, find a safe space, but speak of it publicly and let them know and get the counseling they need to know that this is not their fault, and they're allowed to have control over their own body, if nothing else in their world.
And Farouk?
What I think is, because Islam is such an integral part of Middle Eastern discourse, Islamic law needs to be reformed, and there cannot be any kind of apologetics when it comes to the teachings which promote the emotional blackmail of a woman who does not succumb. They need to just say, I'm sorry, I don't believe in this, and it's gone, it's in the past. The Turkish government was trying out a project like that about 7 years ago. I don't know where that went. That should be picked up again.
Well, after our discussion today, it's important to note that marital rape cannot be viewed in isolation, but as part of the wider issue that is gender-based violence in the Middle East. Whilst there are hints of movement towards change, the road is long. What we might take for granted in the West is that women in the Middle East face discriminatory legal provisions in personal status laws which govern almost every aspect of their lives, including marriage, divorce, custody and guardianship, and inheritance. Therefore, it's no wonder women feel they have no other choice but to stay in an abusive marriage and succumb to her husband's authority. It will take more than laws on paper to change mentalities. Campaigners from both sexes must continue to speak out, giving women from all stratas of society in the Middle East the courage to exercise choice. We await the day when it will be acceptable for a woman to refuse to have sex with her husband just because she chooses to. I'd like to thank all my guests on today's show: Ghida Anani, Paula Salwan Daher, Lina Khalife, Fatima Siddiqui, and of course my studio guests, Hilary Stauffer and Farouk Peru. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Until next time, goodbye.